Hi, hope you can hear me. Firstly, thank you for attending my presentation. My name is Kavindra and I'm obsessed with words. Currently, I'm a senior technical writer at Luxoft, working on the Qt Automotive Suite. I started out as a technical writer at Charles in 2007. Later on, I worked for other companies, specifically on developer content. I worked in SharePoint 2013 and Office 365 content for Microsoft, and recently I also worked on REST APIs and SDK content for Here Maps. Basically, I spent a lot of time digging through large amounts of text. The goal, of course, is to find a common thread that is interesting enough to weave a story for developers. I also delete a lot of text. It's not always content that I wrote or my colleagues though, but sometimes it's just really old text that's been there for years. I also draw some diagrams. But that's basically it. Technical writing in a nutshell. The goal of this talk today is threefold. I'll introduce the types of documentation we usually see. I'll share my 3 tips, as promised. I'm also hoping to convince some of you that writing documentation doesn't always have to be a boring or a painful task. By the way, if you have any questions, we can discuss them at the end of the talk. So, what is software documentation? Documentation and the hip-hop music genre actually have one thing in common. Not everyone likes it. This is not the fault of documentation per se, but I think it's because documentation is a kind of a fuzzy term that relates to so many forms of content, such as API reference, conceptual documentation, changelog or release notes if it's more verbose than this. Code examples, tutorials, technical white papers, and so on. In my experience, documentation work is often done very late in the development process. For example, in the simplified process here, this is fiction, of course, you have 4 sprints before you get to documentation. And you start with API design. So you're very ambitious and it's all going well, lots of coding work, some testing, and definitely a string review. But notice that documentation is at the end, just before the release. This type of process usually results in a situation where the developers want to move on and work on their new exciting code, but they still have to write documentation for the code that they've just completed. So this can cause some unpleasant feelings to come up when developers need to write. Now, writing, for me at least, is all about feelings. Think of the last time you had to write an important email, but you were annoyed. I have some tips to share, after which I'm hoping they will influence just a bit how you feel when you're writing content. For context, these tips can be applied to most documentation forms, particularly conceptual documentation, release notes, code examples, and tutorials. In this scope, I'm using the term conceptual documentation broadly to mean content that describes concepts related to a product. And the term product, I'm also being very broad about it for now, quite generic. It can be any component or a part of a feature, and so on. Anything you're working on. So it's a bit forgiving this time. Let's take a look at the first tip. Identify your audience. Content is always tailored to a specific audience. You wouldn't give a technical white paper to a developer looking for an API reference. So spend some time identifying who your audience is. You don't have to come up with a persona, but it's quick to list just 2 things. What do they know, which we call prerequisites? What don't they know? This is the content that you provide along with the links and references to complete the story. Identifying the prerequisites is always worth your time because it means it's content that you no longer have to write anymore, meaning it's one thing off your plate. Now, there are many types of audience who may read your documentation. Perhaps Perhaps you have a beginner or an intermediate developer who may be new to the programming language. Of course, you may also have advanced developers. I usually call them the people who eat microchips for breakfast because they don't want your conceptual content. All they're interested is in looking for code samples that they can analyze, definitely break, rebuild, and finally understand how your code works. You could also have product managers or industry analysts reading your content. Then you may have to provide more background information so they can build this context, and you probably also have to define all your acronyms the first time. For example, in Qt, you may have noticed there's no documentation on how to write basic C++ code. This is because the prerequisite for Qt documentation is that the reader already knows C++. My second tip is to draw a diagram. A diagram is worth 1,000 words. If your product has dependencies with other components outside of your scope, or if you happen to be collaborating with other teams across the globe, which is very common these days, drawing a diagram is always worth your time. When your diagram is almost done, you can send it out. Share it with your stakeholders. Now, this process of getting feedback on your diagram is an interesting experiment because a diagram is a way of putting everything on the table. It's a way to find out what everyone understands about your product. You'd be surprised what you find out sometimes. And it's also a way to weed out discrepancies like, how many components are there? Which team owns which component? How do these components interact? When you have a diagram that's 80% accurate, you can use it. I say 80% because getting to 100% accuracy can be time-consuming. As long as the diagram doesn't show something is wrong, it's good to go. If some parts are fuzzy or open to interpretation, that's also fine, because you can fix that in your next iteration. Make sure that your diagram looks professional, is aligned, and well-spaced. There is a difference between a good diagram and a bad diagram. Here is a bad diagram. To be honest, it's a bit hard for me to draw one intentionally, but I've been told seeing is believing, so I feel like I have to show you what a bad diagram looks like. But why is this a bad diagram? Let's take a closer look. The spacing between these elements aren't consistent. The arrows, they overlap each other. This is a big no-no if you want your diagrams to look professional. The fonts are all different, and in some of the boxes, the font colors are also different. At first glance, it's not such a bad thing, but if you have to draw a lot of these diagrams, then it's really worth it to find out how to write a good diagram, or draw a good diagram that is a bit more professional than this. Here's a good diagram. I'm not saying it because I do it myself, but I'll explain why it's good. In this case, the spacing of most of the elements are all somewhat consistent. The font in this case, they're all identical, and notice that the arrows no longer overlap. Each group of elements are labeled correctly. We also have a legend to provide the reader with some context why we color these boxes specifically. Oops. Now let's reevaluate. We are 2 tips down and 1 tip to go. At this point, you know who your audience is. You've also drawn your diagram. These are your 2 pillars to determine the scope of your content. Now you can write. But what should you write? This brings me to my last tip, which is what, why, and how. This is my formula. Every time somebody assigns me a task to write content, I always ask these 3 annoying questions. This is a rough sample structure. Assuming you're writing a static document, of course you have many pages in reality. And if you're writing for a website, some of this content would be spread across different pages and you would link to from some master page or landing page. If we look closer at this structure, the first block is, what does your product do? We call this a product definition. Defining what your product does is really useful because you can reuse this definition everywhere. In emails, in your slides, in communication with your colleagues by the coffee machine, and so on, resulting in a very consistent message across all your product communication. This way, if somebody reuses your definition, it's still what you're very sure of. If you're unsure whether your definition is correct, write it anyway. When you run it by stakeholders, they can help improve it. If you know anything about your stakeholders, normally they're perfectionists, and perfectionist people cannot handle it when something is wrong, so they will definitely correct you. The second block is your diagram from tip number 2. Usually this is the best place to place it, but it's not mandatory. You can place it wherever you like. Moving on, the third block is, why should someone use your product? Now this someone you've already defined. It's usually from your tip 1, which is your audience. And you should consider focusing on that scope only. The keyword here though is use, which is a hint for use cases. Highlight important use cases that your product does successfully. You can quietly not mention the ones that it doesn't do successfully. Nobody needs to know at this point. A lot of people forget this block because often when you work on some product for months or even years and prepare it for release, we are so convinced on why customers would use our product. But your customer doesn't always know where your product fits into their use case. So sell it here. You don't need long paragraphs. Bullet points and full sentences are always okay. Next we have, how should someone use your product? Notice the how box is a bit bigger because there is some work to do here. It's usually where you put your code snippets and examples. There are 2 ways to fill in this how section. You could choose to go vertically or horizontally. Vertically means how your product can be used standalone. Horizontally means how your product can be used in combination with other products. The first one, vertical, is usually easier to write because it's self-contained and you probably have enough information to get started. For example, this would be code snippets that you might extract from test cases. They're always guaranteed to work, right? Horizontal content is a bit harder because customers, while they expect this content, customers and industry analysts, it means you have to do more work on this part. Usually there's more research, more digging, and a lot more time consuming in that sense. But it's nowadays, it's kind of expected and it's in demand because it helps customers and industry analysts understand how to mix your product with other products. It's also a very good yardstick. But if you're short on time, like we all mostly are these days, provide vertical content at least. If you have the time, it's worth investing in horizontal content, even if you only provide flowcharts or code stubs to describe the necessary steps. Here's an example of a product definition for Qt Automotive Suite. Notice that we only have 3 sentences. There are 2 keywords here, IVI and Genevieve. These are the words that we use to connect the definition to the automotive story. So people look for these buzzwords. And we have a phrase called the collection of software components and tools. But that gives you the first definition in the first sentence itself. One more example is Qt Remote Objects product definition. There are only 2 sentences here, and the keywords this time would be IPC and extends Qt's existing functionalities. So you have the important bits right in your first sentence. For more detailed look, we can look at the actual documentation here. So this is a landing page for Qt Automotive Suite. Diagram is a bit familiar now, I'm hoping. That's the definition. Then you have the diagram. So you have all your what in the first paragraph, and then you have a diagram. But these tables at the bottom, the components and tools, they are a mixture of what and why. So some of the use cases are combined into these sentences here. And finally, you have your how. And the how is install and examples. These are reference content as well. So this is a rough idea how I usually structure the content. Similarly, Qt Remote Objects, this is more interesting because they have use cases that have been pulled out here, but this is the why, sorry, this is what. Remote Objects is one of those components that has lots of concepts. So you write some blurbs around it to give the reader a chance to understand it a bit more before you dive in. So this is what, and then a little bit of why and the use case. Much more clear, bullet points that I mentioned earlier. Followed by the guides. These are all the list of topics that are related. And then the how is hidden inside. Getting started, interaction, troubleshooting, and protocol versioning. Finally, you have reference. So these are kind of good formulas that usually work for me. So now that I've shared my 3 tips with you, I'm hoping that they're useful for you when you need to write documentation. Thanks again for your time. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them now.
Many thanks, Kavindra, and very nice voice.
Hey, Kai.
Hey. What's your favorite tool to actually draw these diagrams?
Depends if there's license involved or not. If there's a license, then Visio is amazing. Otherwise, we're using Draw.io these days, and it's quite stable.
Draw.io?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Thank you. Yes, I will try to formulate a question. We are trying to build a wiki, a Confluence wiki, and so we are creating a kind of a shared documentation. So we have product managers and we have software developers, and we are trying to describe our products and add some content. So I'm trying to find a figure just comparable to use, which everybody understands. So we have 100 people or so who we want to enable to add some content. And do you have any hints or so, or any experience in such a setup where not only some people creating the documentation, but a lot of?
Yeah. You would have to start with templates. Like, you would be a bit more strict when you start out. Since you have 100, you would pick maybe 20 people and start it small and encourage them to use the templates. And then as it grows, somebody has to do gardening, like going through and making sure some things fit. And usually from 100 people, I'm guessing in my experience, a good 70 people would kind of follow the rules. And you have this naughty 30% of the people who would not always follow the rules. So the goal is to give them templates and try to teach them to align their thoughts or to structure it. And the easiest way is to always have some kind of advanced or reference page where people can dump their ideas so they don't feel like they're being stifled. But then at least they have a place to put content that you may not always feel goes in together. And then later you have hopefully you have some time to move that content into a structure that you would like. So you would start small first, about half or a quarter of your team first, and see how it grows organically. Sure.
Here.
Oh, yeah, hi, what's up?
Hi. What program or programs are you using, or are your favorite to create developers documentation and the customer documentation?
It depends. When I work in automotive, at least here maps, customers wanted PDFs. So as long as you use something that everybody was okay with, some other tool like Data XML, if you're unlucky, or Markdown, you end up with PDFs and the customer was happy. From a developer perspective, that's really tricky because you end up, either you can please the writers. If you have a large team of writers, you can choose tools that writers like. But then you might not end up with tools that developers like. And if you want developers to put their content into the same place as the writers, some database or something, and there happens to be tools that devs don't like, you're going to have this uphill battle of trying to convince them to use tools that they hate. And you know in your experience that it's very hard to convince developers to do that. So you have to find some middle ground on tools that really work. What's really trending these days is Markdown and RSD, like the Python style one with Sphinx. Those two seem to be tools that developers don't hate. So you're much more likely to get them to put their content in. Otherwise, you just end up with gray hair yourself, which is not a very nice thing in the long term for a job. So yeah, definitely Markdown RSD. Try to avoid XML. Devs hate that. Sure.
Any additional questions? If not so, then thanks again, Kavindra. Thanks again to the audience, and enjoy the third presentation, which will follow in a few minutes.